I read a poem once, and it went something like, "On the morning of my death, it will rain sideways against my window." In a vacuum, this doesn't sound like much, but it's an impression that stuck with me all these years, and I found it to be rather comforting, that somehow the world could react subtly to your absence. Maybe it's just reading too much into the details, but that minutia is actually the essence of Flashpoint, the theme of the DC experience that essentially boils down to this idea of absolute points, where the names and legacies at its center are akin to cells inside the organs of the universe. The relationship is a symbiosis of sorts. The characters operate as the embodiment of the intangible world, and the universe reflects upon its own designs through these particulates. This metaphorical manifestation is awesome, because it allows DC to use its absolute points as the metaphysical materials necessary for storytelling. And when things deviate off script, the universe will make an effort to restore the equilibrium, even if it does so sideways. Though the changes are subtle, in relation to a speedster, the lens of absoluteness becomes a logistical nightmare, and that in turn brings us to now, the deviations of the Flashpoint paradox. Superman is still Superman, and vengeance will always reside in Gotham, but let's say the minutia changes not just once, but throughout time. Let's say there's one character whose absolute point is not just confined to his world, but to all worlds, everywhere, whenever he wishes. That's a cost of freedom that pays its own price, where sometimes what ends up taking your place is even worse than nothing at all. In a universe that guarantees its absolute points, what would the importance be for their existence now? There seems to be something poetic about breaking everything. Oh boy. The promises of an Elseworld Flashpoint are fascinating. It's hard to capture the extreme swings of the Flashpoint pendulum when your only resources for interpretation are 80s Batman and a second Ezra Miller. This is an interesting limitation because it opens the door to the merit of creativity and why this movie, at this exact time, should even exist in the first place. Ultimately, I think it's more about the opportunity. Sure, nostalgia is what dominates headlines, but DC has never had the most robust backlog to pull from, and nostalgia requires a level of cohesivity to function. It'd be easier to keep Flash as an Elseworld project in any other circumstance, but since we're beginning a new cinematic universe, why not pull identities that are so unaffiliated with one another that tying up their loose ends becomes not just a creative choice, but the perfect one? In a world where we won't be getting the ideal reimagining of the source material, it's important to instead look at Flashpoint as a purely interpretive exercise. Imagine it rejects harmonizing the old and new stories together, and instead weaponizes them for a larger purpose: hope. Navigating a fractured timeline is incredibly relevant both in and out of Flashpoint, and if the movie serves as a microcosm for the larger failures of the DCEU, it would give weight to Flash as a messenger for his world, but also this new one. Suddenly, he becomes the physical catalyst for a literal better universe and offers a chance for reinvention before everything is reset. This reform is even reiterated in all the fundamental tones of Flashpoint, if somehow just running a little faster was enough to offset the dilating consequences.
I just wanted to save her. Her hero. How noble. Oh wait, you didn't stop JFK from getting assassinated, or make sure Hitler stayed in art school. You saved your mommy. You missed her. And in a supreme act of selfishness, shattered history like a rank amateur. Turned the world into a living hell moments away from destruction. And I'm the villain?
The lesson here is that acceptance is about loving the past retroactively, and leaving the timeline we yearn for is a step towards the direction of hope. Hope as an idea is an inherently selfish position because it asserts the vantage of the speaker first against the operance of the world second. Much like how saying "I love you" confirms the identity of the self before affirming the value of the other person, hope is a steady commitment imbued into those brave enough to disseminate it. The intrigue of Flash in his paradox isn't just that he's running due to a lack of hope, but that he remains selfishly blinded by its absence. Barry is unwilling to believe in its dissemination, even at the cost of everyone else, and that plays brilliantly against the adage of not shooting the messenger. Weaponizing that theme fits perfectly into Barry's place in this dystopia, because the commitment to hope is diametrically opposed to the natural order of the timeline Barry's in. Out of place, Barry is still an absolute point that can unknowingly bring hope to a world devoid of it, and a world that lacks that belief, even within its own constants, is not only improper, but dying. It's a bit of a cheeky homage to 70s sci-fi, but as a character, Flash has always been the simplest member of the Justice League, and that makes him the ideal candidate for a story centered around unresolved closure, for both the hero and the audience. This version of Flashpoint might attempt to use the animated series and original DC cinematic universe as a crucible for storytelling, to form a canonical singularity, fixing all that was broken and giving life to something new. I kind of hope that it does. In a perfect universe, no one needs to die for the Flash to leave an impact, but it would be foolish to not recognize the poetic opportunity available for treating Flashpoint as its own cultural reset. The simplicity of Barry Allen trying to find happiness could highlight the gravitas of the world he's both created and is subsequently destroying, even to the point of how hope changes people against overwhelming odds. If creative enough, the Flash could harmonize itself with what comes next for the DCEU. Hope always starts off as a selfish view of the world, but for Barry, selfishness might be the only move available. What if instead of fixing his mistake, he chooses to embrace it? Embracing the lack of commitment to his future, the inability to heal, thus staying with his mom and condemning his timeline to destruction. This selfishness of choice would effectively destroy all strands in the timeline that came before, thus creating a new singularity, a birthing of a new DC universe, a reset point with no absolute points except one. Hope is always selfish until it can't be anymore, until it destroys itself to give way to itself, to selflessness, to the one that will matter most. And as always, thanks for watching.